He just wanted a quiet cup of coffee, but the night had other plans. When a gang of rockers decided to test him, they had no idea who they were dealing with. What happened next left the entire bar in shock. Watch until the end to see the unbelievable outcome. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a desolate ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast American landscape. The stars flickered dimly against the ink-black sky, and the air was thick with the scent of distant rain, the promise of a storm lingering on the horizon. The only sound was the steady hum of an engine, a lone pickup truck gliding smoothly along the road, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Behind the wheel sat Jackie Chan, his hands relaxed but firm, his gaze unwavering as he surveyed the empty stretch ahead. The drive had been long, but fatigue had yet to settle in. Years of training had conditioned him to remain alert, his instincts sharp even in moments of solitude. He wasn't traveling with a set destination, only the road guided him. Tonight, however, he felt the need for a short break, if only to stretch his legs and grab a hot cup of coffee. That was when he saw it, a neon sign glowing faintly in the distance, a beacon in the night. The sign flickered erratically, casting an eerie red hue over the gravel lot below. Red Viper Saloon, a weathered roadside bar that looked as though it had stood untouched for decades. The building itself was worn, its wooden siding faded and splintered, the windows clouded with years of dust and neglect. A lone street lamp flickered near the entrance, casting long, jagged shadows against the dirt-streaked exterior. Jackie slowed his truck, pulling into the sparsely populated parking lot. An old semi-truck sat near the far end, its trailer coated in dust. A couple of rusted-out pickups were parked haphazardly, but what caught his eye was the row of motorcycles lined neatly near the front. Harleys gleaming under the dim glow of the neon sign, their chrome accents catching what little light there was. It was a familiar sight, one he had seen many times before. He stepped out of the truck, rolling his shoulders as he took in the scent of rain, dust, and oil. The air was thick, heavy with the anticipation of an oncoming storm. Jackie glanced up at the sky. Clouds were gathering, stretching like dark fingers across the expanse. He turned his attention back to the bar, already sensing the energy inside. It was a feeling he had grown accustomed to over the years. The heavy wooden door creaked as he pushed it open. The moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere wrapped around him like a thick fog. Stale beer, cigarette smoke, the faint scent of sweat and grease. The lighting was dim, uneven pools of yellowish glow cast by flickering overhead bulbs. The jukebox in the corner played an old rock tune, the volume just low enough to allow the murmurs of conversation to carry through the room. At first glance, the bar was typical. A few truckers hunched over their drinks, a couple of locals playing pool near the back. But his attention was quickly drawn to a particular group, the rockers. They sat, sprawled in the farthest corner, clad in worn leather jackets adorned with faded patches and logos from bands long forgotten. Their presence was impossible to ignore. They spoke loudly, laughing at jokes only they found amusing, their boots propped up on chairs as they drank without a care. Empty beer bottles littered the table in front of them. Jackie had been in places like this before. He knew their type. They weren't bikers in the traditional sense, no brotherhood, no code, no discipline. They were simply men who carried themselves like they owned whatever space they occupied. He paid them no mind, moving towards the bar with an easy but purposeful stride. The bartender, a burly man with graying hair and tired eyes, barely spared him a glance before wiping down the counter. Jackie took a seat at the bar, resting his forearms against the scratched wooden surface. "Coffee," he said simply. The bartender hesitated, giving him a once-over, as if gauging whether he belonged here. Finally, with a small nod, he turned to pour the drink. Jackie remained silent, listening, observing. Years of experience had taught him that trouble always had a way of announcing itself long before it arrived. And tonight, trouble sat in the farthest corner of the room, eyeing him like a predator sizing up its prey. He could feel their glances, hear the muttered words followed by quiet laughter. It was a script he had seen play out too many times before. A stranger walks into a place where he isn't expected. Some men take offense to that. Some need to make it known who is in charge. Jackie had no intention of starting trouble, but he had long accepted that trouble often had a way of finding him. The bartender placed the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. Jackie wrapped his hands around the ceramic, letting the warmth seep into his palms. He took a slow sip, savoring the moment. Behind him, the murmurs grew louder. A chair scraped against the floor. Heavy boots moved deliberately across the wooden planks, unhurried and intentional. The first approach. Jackie didn't turn around. He simply waited. A large man stopped just within his peripheral vision, close enough that Jackie could smell a mix of beer and cigarettes clinging to his clothes. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then came the voice. "You lost, old man?" Jackie didn't react immediately. He set his cup down with measured calm, finally turning his head just enough to glance at the man. He was broad-shouldered, thick around the middle in a way that suggested past strength softened by years of easy victories and heavy drinking. His leather jacket bore a faded emblem, some defunct band's logo, meaningless and forgotten. The rocker smirked, though there was no humor in it. He was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push. Jackie met his gaze for a moment, then turned back to his coffee. "No," he said simply. The response was dismissive, and that was enough to set things in motion. A second man joined the first, his approach more brazen. He was leaner, younger, but carried the same smug amusement. He leaned against the bar beside Jackie, too close for it to be anything but intentional. "That a fact?" the younger one said, his grin widening. "See, the thing is, this ain't really a place for—" He trailed off, choosing his words carefully, letting his gaze sweep over Jackie with a slow, deliberate once-over. Jackie didn't need to hear the rest of that sentence to know how it was going to end. The younger rocker smirked, but before he could push further, a voice cut through the room. "That's enough." The tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, a finality. The two rockers hesitated, then stepped aside. Jackie turned slightly, finally getting a clear look at the man who had spoken. Ray Thunder Miller. Even sitting down, Ray was an imposing figure. His long, graying hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, his beard thick but well-maintained. His black leather jacket was scuffed and worn from years of use. Unlike the others, he didn't look amused. He exhaled a slow breath, then leaned forward, resting his tattooed forearms on the table. "I don't think our friend here meant any harm," Ray said, his voice smooth but carrying weight. His gaze locked onto Jackie's, sharp, assessing. "Did you, stranger?" Jackie didn't answer right away. He studied the man, taking in the details, the posture, the tone, the way the others deferred to him. A leader. Jackie had seen men like Ray before, men who had spent their lives at the top, men who weren't used to being challenged. Jackie picked up his coffee, took another slow sip. "No harm intended," he said finally. Ray nodded, considering. Then, with a smirk, he turned back to his men. "You see? The man's just here for coffee?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Ain't that something?" The tension should have eased, but it didn't, because Jackie knew exactly where this was headed. Jackie remained seated at the bar, his fingers resting lightly on the ceramic rim of his coffee cup. He didn't need to turn around to feel the weight of their stares pressing against his back. The room had changed. The easy bravado of the rockers had shifted into something heavier, something more deliberate. It was no longer just casual amusement at the presence of an outsider. Now, it was a test. Jackie knew how this would play out. He had seen it too many times before. The bartender hesitated behind the counter, his eyes flicking toward the group in the corner. He wasn't a fool. He had seen these men in action before. He had seen how they handled strangers, how they picked their fights. And yet, there was something different about the man sitting at his bar now. Something that made the usual script feel off. Still, he leaned in slightly and spoke just low enough for Jackie to hear. "You sure you want to be here?" Jackie lifted the cup to his lips, took a slow sip, and then placed it back down with the same steady calm. "Just passing through." The bartender exhaled quietly, shaking his head. "Might want to keep it that way." Before Jackie could respond, a heavy chair scraped against the wooden floor behind him. Heavy boots followed, measured footsteps crossing the room with slow, deliberate intent. The first approach had been a warning. This was the next stage. Jackie didn't turn around. He simply waited. A large figure stopped a few feet away, just at the edge of his peripheral vision. The scent of stale beer and sweat mixed with the sharp edge of cigarette smoke. Then came the voice. "You lost, old man?" Jackie didn't move. He didn't even glance up. Instead, he picked up his cup again, his movements unhurried. "No." Silence stretched between them, thick and tangible. The rocker's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before twisting into something sharper. This wasn't the response he had expected. He shifted his stance, letting his arms hang loosely by his sides, his fingers twitching slightly as if testing how much strength still coiled in them. "See? That's the thing," the man continued, voice low but laced with false amusement. "This ain't really a place for guys like you." Jackie finally turned his head slightly, just enough to meet the man's gaze. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence was enough. The younger rocker, the leaner one with the smug grin, took that as an opportunity to step in. He slid into the space beside Jackie, leaning one elbow lazily against the bar, too close for it to be casual. "You hear what he's saying?" The younger one's grin widened. "This ain't exactly your kind of place." Jackie inhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the side of his coffee cup before he finally exhaled. "I'm just here for coffee." The words were calm, neutral, but that wasn't what they wanted. The younger rocker let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah? Well, I think you—" Before he could finish, a voice from the far end of the room cut through the air. "That's enough." The two rockers hesitated, their expressions shifting for the briefest second before they stepped back. Jackie turned his head slightly, just enough to see the man at the table. Ray Thunder Miller. Unlike the others, Ray hadn't stood up yet. He remained seated, his arms resting on the table, his fingers interlocked. He didn't look amused. He exhaled slowly, then finally leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Jackie's. "I don't think our friend here meant any harm," Ray said, voice smooth but carrying weight. "Did you?" Jackie studied the man, taking in the details. The way he carried himself. The way the others deferred to him. A leader. Not just of this group, but of many rooms like this before. He knew this type. Jackie picked up his cup, took another slow sip. No harm intended. Ray nodded slowly, as if weighing the words, then smirked. He turned to his men, exhaling through his nose. "You see?" he said, gesturing lazily toward Jackie. "The man's just here for coffee." He let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Ain't that something?" The tension in the room should have eased. It didn't, because Ray wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, picking up his beer bottle, swirling the liquid inside as he stared at Jackie with unreadable intent. Then, with a slow, casual movement, he set the bottle down and exhaled. "But, he continued, his voice shifting just slightly. "It's funny. You see a man like you, someone who don't belong, and it makes you wonder." Jackie remained silent. He had no interest in playing this game, but he knew better than to think he had a choice. Ray's smirk widened. "Makes you wonder why he thinks he can just walk into a place like this and not show respect." The word respect hung in the air like a challenge. One of the rockers behind Jackie let out a low chuckle. The others shifted in their seats, their movements casual but deliberate. They were preparing themselves, the way predators do when they sense weakness. Jackie exhaled quietly, rolling his shoulders slightly as if easing tension. He wasn't tense. He wasn't nervous. He had just hoped it wouldn't come to this. But it always did, didn't it? Ray studied him for a moment longer, then reached out and knocked the coffee cup off the bar. The ceramic shattered against the floor, the dark liquid spreading across the worn wooden planks, irregular stains forming like ink bleeding through old parchment. Jackie stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze. Ray smirked. "Well now," he murmured, voice laced with amusement. "What do you think about that, stranger?" Jackie didn't answer, because he already knew how this was going to end. The bar was silent, thick with anticipation. The moment the coffee cup shattered against the floor, the air shifted. Jackie remained still, his gaze locked onto Ray's, reading the weight behind his smirk. The leader of the rockers leaned back in his chair, satisfied with his display, his fingers tapping lazily against the table as if waiting for a reaction. But Jackie gave him none. Instead, he exhaled slowly, letting the tension settle around them like a coiled spring waiting to snap. He knew what was coming next. The first move came fast. One of the younger rockers, emboldened by Ray's challenge, took a step forward and shoved Jackie's shoulder. It wasn't a full attack. Not yet. Just a test. Jackie didn't move. Another shove followed, harder this time. The younger rocker chuckled, convinced he had the upper hand. "Looks like the old man's got some sense," he muttered. But before he could say more, Jackie moved. His hand shot out, his fingers locking around the man's wrist in an iron grip. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. With a simple twist, he turned the rocker's arm inward, forcing him off balance. In the same fluid movement, Jackie brought his knee up, striking the man hard in the ribs. The rocker gasped. The air knocked from his lungs as he crumpled to the floor, clutching his side. Silence fell over the room for the briefest second. Then chaos erupted. A second man lunged, swinging a wild punch toward Jackie's head. He ducked, sidestepped, and brought his elbow up into the attacker's jaw. The impact sent the rocker stumbling backward, his body crashing against an empty table, sending bottles flying. Another came at him with a broken pool cue, gripping it like a weapon. Jackie caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted sharply, and forced the makeshift club from his grip. In the same movement, he drove a fist into the man's stomach, knocking him to the ground with a controlled shove. The remaining rockers hesitated, uncertainty flickering across their faces. They had assumed this would be easy. A quick show of dominance, a few laughs at the stranger's expense. Now, two of them lay groaning on the floor, and the others were beginning to realize they had made a mistake. But they weren't ready to admit it yet. Two came at him together, thinking that numbers would give them an advantage. The first threw a punch, but Jackie sidestepped, caught the man's arm mid-swing, and drove his fist into the exposed ribs. The second barely had time to react before Jackie's boot connected with his knee, sending him crashing down with a sharp cry of pain. The fight was over in seconds. The rockers lay sprawled across the floor, some clutching their ribs, others rolling onto their backs, trying to catch their breath. But it wasn't finished. Jackie knew it the moment he turned his gaze back to Ray. The leader of the rockers had not moved. He remained seated, watching the destruction of his men with unreadable eyes. He had let them go first, let them test the stranger, and now he knew the truth. Jackie was not some weary traveler who had stumbled into the wrong bar. He was something else, something Ray didn't fully understand. Slowly, deliberately, Ray leaned forward, resting his tattooed forearms against the table. "Well," he muttered, his smirk twitching slightly, "looks like we got ourselves a real tough guy." Jackie didn't respond. He simply watched as Ray exhaled and rolled his shoulders before standing. Unlike his men, there was no hesitation in his movement, no sign of nervousness or uncertainty. He was taller than Jackie, broader, a man who had spent years in fights and had come out on top more often than not. But Jackie had fought bigger men before. He had fought stronger men before. Strength alone wouldn't win this fight. Ray cracked his knuckles, flexing his fingers, his smirk widening. "Let's see how tough you really are." Jackie shifted his stance slightly, his body relaxing into readiness. He wasn't looking for a fight, but Ray had made it clear there was no walking away from this. The others had been impulsive, reckless. Ray would not be. He was calculating, experienced, the kind of man who had ruled rooms like this for years. But Jackie had faced men like him before, and he knew exactly how this was going to end. Ray Thunder Miller stood motionless for a long moment, rolling his shoulders as if loosening himself up for what was to come. Unlike his men, who had rushed in blindly and been swiftly taken down, Ray understood how to read an opponent, and he had been watching Jackie closely. The way he moved, the efficiency of his strikes, the way he never wasted emotion, it all told Ray one thing. This wasn't just some stranger passing through town. This was a fighter, a real one. And that meant Ray had to approach this differently. The silence in the bar stretched thick and heavy. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of the downed rockers, groaning on the floor as they struggled to recover from the beating they had received. The bartender stood frozen behind the counter, gripping it as if it was the only thing keeping him steady. The few remaining patrons, truckers and locals who had wisely stayed out of the fight, watched with wide eyes, their drinks forgotten, their backs pressed against the walls, unwilling to move lest they draw attention to themselves. Jackie didn't make the first move. He remained exactly where he was, calm, steady, his breathing even. He had been in situations like this before. He knew what was coming next. Ray flexed his fingers once, then took a slow step forward. His boots made a heavy sound against the wooden floor, a measured pace, deliberate, calculated. His eyes never left Jackie's, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might speak. But instead, without warning, he struck. He moved faster than a man his size should have been able to, his fist cutting through the air in a powerful arc aimed directly at Jackie's jaw. But Jackie had anticipated it. He tilted his head just slightly, letting the punch sail past by mere inches, the force of the swing disturbing the air beside him. Ray's momentum carried him forward, and Jackie used that split-second opening to counter. He drove his palm into Ray's chest, striking with enough force to send him stumbling back a step. It wasn't enough to drop him, not yet, but it was a message, a warning. Ray's smirk returned. "All right," he muttered under his breath, then he charged. The fight exploded into motion. Ray swung again, and this time Jackie blocked the strike, catching the man's wrist in a vice-like grip. He twisted, applying pressure to the joint, but Ray was strong, stronger than the others had been. He powered through the hold, using brute strength to yank his arm free before immediately driving his knee up toward Jackie's ribs. Jackie twisted his body at the last second, absorbing the impact but lessening the damage. Pain flared through his side, but he ignored it. Pain was nothing new. Ray pressed the attack. He threw another punch, then another, his strikes heavy, forceful, relentless. Jackie dodged, sidestepped, deflected where he could, but the man was aggressive, unyielding. Unlike the others, Ray wasn't relying on intimidation. He was fighting like someone who had spent his life throwing punches and receiving them in return. A bottle shattered somewhere behind them. Someone shouted. The bartender was yelling for them to take it outside, but his voice was distant, irrelevant. Ray feinted to the left, then went for a hook to the ribs. Jackie blocked it with his forearm, then snapped forward, driving his own fist into Ray's stomach with enough force to make the bigger man grunt. Ray stumbled back, but only for a second. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then grinned. "Not bad," he admitted. Then he reached down, grabbed a bar stool, and swung it. The wooden seat sliced through the air, aimed directly at Jackie's head. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the impact, but Ray wasn't finished. He twisted his grip on the stool and brought it down in a powerful overhead swing. Jackie had no choice but to step back. The stool slammed into the floor where he had been standing a second ago, the force of the impact sending splinters flying. Ray tossed the broken stool aside. "Come on," he goaded. "Thought you were tough." Jackie said nothing. Instead, he moved. He closed the distance in an instant, his foot snapping forward, striking Ray in the knee. The bigger man let out a sharp grunt as his leg buckled, and in that moment of weakness, Jackie struck again. A punch to the ribs, another to the jaw. Ray staggered, but he didn't fall. Instead, he let out a low growl, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. Then, with renewed fury, he lunged. He tackled Jackie, driving him back against the bar with the full weight of his body. Bottles rattled on the shelves behind them. Jackie felt the wood press against his back, but he didn't let the position work against him. He brought his elbow down hard on the back of Ray's neck, once, twice. Ray's grip loosened just enough for Jackie to slip free. He spun, catching Ray by the collar of his leather jacket, and with a sharp twist of his hips, sent the man crashing over the bar counter. Ray landed with a heavy thud, knocking over bottles and glasses as he rolled onto his side. The bartender swore loudly, but neither fighter paid him any mind. Jackie stepped back, breathing evenly, his stance still solid, still unshaken. He had seen fights like this before. They were never over until the other man stayed down. And Ray wasn't staying down. The big man groaned, pushed himself up, and for a moment, he just stood there, his chest rising and falling with deep, heavy breaths. Then, slowly, he looked at Jackie. The smirk was gone. Ray exhaled, shaking his head. "You should have just finished your coffee," he muttered. Then his hand darted toward his belt. A knife. The moment the blade flashed in the dim light of the bar, Jackie knew that Ray had just made his final mistake. He didn't hesitate. He moved before Ray could even bring the knife up, closing the gap between them in a single step. His hand shot out, grabbing Ray's wrist, twisting hard, forcing the weapon away. Ray let out a grunt of frustration, but he was too slow to stop what came next. Jackie struck, a sharp, precise jab to the throat, not enough to crush, but enough to stun. Ray choked, his body seizing up, and in that instant, Jackie swept his legs out from under him. Ray hit the floor hard, his back slamming against the wood. The knife clattered from his grip, spinning uselessly across the planks. For the first time since the fight began, Ray didn't get up. He just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The room was silent. The other rockers, those who were still conscious, looked between their fallen leader and Jackie, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Jackie stepped back, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned, walked back to the bar, and picked up the bills he had left earlier. He placed them down again. "Get a new cup," he said to the bartender. Then he sat down as if nothing had happened at all. The bar was silent, the air thick with the acrid scent of spilled alcohol and the lingering trace of cigarette smoke. Only the occasional groan of one of the fallen rockers broke the oppressive quiet. Ray Thunder Miller lay sprawled on the floor, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His body ached from the punishment he had just endured, but the real wound was deeper than the bruises blooming across his ribs. It was the wound to his pride. For years he had ruled places like this, but now he had nothing to say. Jackie finished his coffee. Then he stood, walked out into the night, and disappeared down the endless highway once more. The bar will never be the same after what happened tonight. One man changed everything in just a few minutes. What do you think about this intense showdown? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more powerful stories and share this video with your friends.